Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast. I'm Gemma Creagh and I'm chatting with director Joe Lee about his film 406 Days. This powerful documentary covers the efforts of the Debenhams workers on their strike where they fought hard for their redundancy. This film will be screened at the Still Voices Film Festival, which takes place from the 15th to the 19th of November in Ballymahon. So thank you so much for chatting with us, Joe.
You're welcome.
A little while back, we actually spoke with Fergus Stout. He's the producer of 406 Days, and Carol Ann Bridgman,
Yes.
who's one of the workers who really stood up so bravely for her rights over that really intense strike. In that podcast, we touched on the immediate outcome of the strike and on Carol's experience on the front lines and some of the logistics about the strike itself. So if anyone's listening in and maybe they're not familiar with the strike, with what we're talking about, that might be a nice place to listen to. Now, I just to go to those really intense moments that you guys documented. Can you tell me a little bit about what your experience was at the time, like way back when, in the midst of COVID, when all this was happening?
Well, I was asked by Fergus, contacted me, and the strike had actually ended a year before I became involved in the making of the film. And because of sort of other work that I had made in the past, Fergus thought that I might be an interesting person to talk to about directing a film about the 406 Days. So it had actually ended nearly 12 months before I became involved. Fergus came across the dispute during COVID while it was still on, you know. So that was. But I wasn't that aware of the issues in the dispute, but I had heard about it, but because it was on during COVID, I was kind of very much like, a member of the public who, just was hearing about this for the first time. So I think that kind of that openness to what this was all about really sort of played well in the making of the film.
Actually, that's a very good perspective to come from, that your eyes are being open to it, and it's a fresh pair of eyes as well.
Yeah, no, I think that made it, something that was a little bit different, because I was kind of in a way the public.
And Fergus, the producer of this, he co-wrote a book about the strike as well. So
yeah.
When you when you came on board, was your first instinct to look at to read the book, to talk to people?
Fergus rang me on a Friday evening, and he sort of talked about the strike, and I said, yeah, I kind of heard about it. And he said, well, look, myself and this woman Sue have written a book about it that we've published, and I said, okay, I'll buy the book and I'll read it. So I went into town on the Saturday, bought the book, and just read it from cover to cover, and I was just sold on the idea of becoming involved in the project, because I hadn't known anything of the detail. I had just heard radio and news reports about it kind of sporadically in the year or two before then, and so that was kind of, I got back onto him on the Sunday and said, yeah, look, I'd really like to be involved. I think by the following weekend we had started doing interviews, so it all happened very quickly.
And thematically, that would have been quite linked to, you're documenting Dublin, you're documenting projects in the past. Can you talk a little bit about your career up to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, way, way, way back in the 1980s, myself and a group of other people formed a company called City Vision Productions. So I suppose that kind of says quite a lot. City Vision was kind of about telling stories that were more urban based. I suppose culture up until that time had been very much sort of focused on Ireland's kind of nearly rural traditions and that. And I think at that stage in the 1980s there was a lot of young musicians and actors and writers and filmmakers trying to reflect a more contemporary experience of life in Ireland. And so I would have been involved I directed a film called Sometimes City in 1985. Then I went on and co-directed with a guy called Frank Deasy, a film called The Courier. And then after we made The Courier, that company, City Vision, closed down. But I continued to make documentaries and dramas that reflected sort of more of an urban culture, I suppose. But from the 1990s and into the early 2000s, I worked in a lot of kind of community settings around Dublin, and I made a series of programs about parts of Dublin. So I've always had an interest in Dublin and in telling Dublin stories. So yeah, so that's kind of it.
An anthropological view of our city. But I think that's so important when it comes to literally documenting it, because there's so much of our culture and our backstories. It's very transient. And if it's not always kind of captured in a specific way, it can be lost so quickly, you know.
But that was what was kind of interesting about the projects that I got involved in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, because a lot of areas in Dublin were going through a process that was called regeneration, but really there wasn't that much regeneration going on. And I worked in Inchicore in a place called St. Michael's Estate, which was like a small Ballymahon, and the work that I ended up doing there was recording the stories from the 1980s onwards, really, and how that housing estate had fared. And that was something that was very interesting, and that led on to doing some work in a place called O'Devany Gardens. And it was to be redeveloped, and both of those regeneration or redevelopment schemes collapsed in the financial crisis. So the promise of a kind of a new future has never been realized, sort of in those places in particular. But from there, then people around the markets area asked me would I document their stories, and I just so happened to become filmmaker in residence for Dublin City Council in 2009. And we were able to kind of fit something together. And I did a film called Bananas on the Breadboard, which was about women's street traders in Dublin from the markets area. And so we kind of told the story of the tradition of how women really had pioneered a way of life there. That was and then during the 1980s, again, it always seems to come back to the 1980s, but there was a huge drugs problem in Dublin. But a lot of those street traders were being taken off the street and being fined, and some of them actually ended up in prison. While this drugs epidemic was sort of sweeping through whole swathes of the city. So that film, Bananas on the Breadboard, kind of, I think, was like a catalyst for me becoming involved in this film, because this was sort of, they were the women who were on the outside on the street, sort of as street traders, and these were people who were in retail on the inside, and it was kind of telling that story. So I've always been interested in stories about women and that. So yeah.
I was just going to say there's a strong feminist theme to your work of working class women and working women, and giving platform to people that maybe wouldn't necessarily have that same voice throughout all echelons of media, which is obviously that's a common thread. Is there any sort of reason that you're particularly, is that something that you're just unconsciously drawn to?
I think that the matriarchy in a lot of those communities where there being a kind of social breakdown. I think the epidemic of drugs from the 1980s onwards really sundered a lot of communities. But the things that held things together were normally the matriarchy, where that was stronger, community sort of seemed to survive longer. So it was kind of in the telling of those stories. But I've also done quite a bit of work about violence against women as well, and because that was kind of another offshoot of social breakdown that was happening in some communities, but right across the board in society as well. So I was involved in doing the video end of an arts project called Once Is Too Much, and we made three or four video installation pieces that recorded some of those stories. So I think that work really sort of was very poignant because it was so, it was such an important sort of issue. And one of the pieces that I made for called Open Season became part of the Irish Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection. So I think it was kind of that mixture of those things kind of happening that brought me very much more into kind of a feminist storytelling of the city and that.
Yeah, and talk about strong women. This film certainly documents women with a backbone of steel, considering all that they've been through, which is really fascinating. Tell me a little bit about your approach when you first came attached to the project.
Well, one of the things that really struck me was this idea of what work meant to people, what and particularly that idea of having a job and having a job for life and what that sort of meant, and that breaking down now into the kind of casualization of a lot of labor. So it was the dignity of and the meaning that work had in people's lives that really sort of interested me, and that's where we kind of started with it. It was so self-evident just what these jobs actually meant to people. Their whole identity was tied up in it. So I kind of felt that was going to be at the core of whatever contribution I was making to the thing. That's what interested me, really.
Yes, and it is. And I think also how at a time where things are sort of changing, where retail is sort of shifting tact, where physical spaces are more costly to maintain, and so much kind of trading now switched to online. And at that time, the online Debenhams store was doing very, very well, where on one sense, as a viewer, you can kind of see how in the eyes of the people making the decisions, these women were just collateral damage that they could kind of swipe off with a pencil, even though these contracts that they had been hard negotiated. There was still money floating around, and it was a very kind of calculated cauterization of the Irish leg of Debenhams. And I'm just wondering, like, there's sort of a lot of factors to unpack when it comes to what actually happened, and we did kind of go into detail about the practicalities, but as a filmmaker, like, it's so big. Like, on one hand, you have these stories of these women going through the wars, and it's a very visceral, very emotional journey, but on this other hand, you have all these like things at play. As a filmmaker, how do you go, okay, well, this is how I'm going to get this on the page?
I think really, the journey of the dispute, and the journey of the people on the picket line was our guiding star, really, and on that. And although there were kind of difficult things to describe, for instance, when KPMG and Mandate officials came together, and they sort of publicized that they had come to a resolution without kind of consulting the women on the picket line. And so things like that
Mansplaining at its best.
Things like that were really important, and kind of in a way sort of symbolized kind of the things that were going on underneath all of this, but ours wasn't to do an investigative journalist sort of piece on it. That's a perfectly legitimate way of, say, looking at a project like this. But we felt, no, we were kind of following the human story of these women as this situation evolved, and their responses to it and their strategies that they applied. We did consider at one stage, will we go in and try and look at the sort of the history of Debenhams and all of that, and we kind of said no, really, that's another type of film, and we were better sort of sticking with the route that we had chosen, and that was following the story as it evolved. But we did obviously do some research on those things, and from the early 2000s, really, Debenhams had been sort of hollowed out. Its assets were constantly being sort of sold and traded, it was being taken off the stock exchange and then refloated after some more of its assets had been sort of stripped, kind of bare. And I think, I think Carmel Redmond at one stage in the film says, we didn't know, it kept on changing hands. We didn't know who owned it, from one day to the next. And it always seemed that they were kind of the collateral damage in those processes that went on. But we couldn't get into just the specifics of all of the granular detail of all of those things. But I think it's very much, like the women themselves knew that online was happening and that things were changing and that. And really all that they wanted was that the deal that they had kind of fought very hard for would be honored. And in hindsight, sort of looking back at it now, really that liquidation should never have happened. It should never have been allowed to happen, because all of the facts weren't out and on the table. So so that's why we use that very simple device at the end of just sort of saying what the outcomes were on a few fronts. But it was it was a decision I was sort of really pleased that we made, to follow the women's story, and they led the dispute, and they sort of led in terms of describing what happened.
So I'm going to go a little bit into the technical elements with you about the film, and then I'd love to talk about sort of the outcome and how it was received, because I know you had some really good screenings, but I'm just going to kind of delve into just the technical aspects first.
Sure,
I know there has been some changes in the meantime. So with regards to planning the structure, when did the countdown element take shape?
Yeah, when we went around to the various stores, because what kind of interested me as well was it wasn't just a Dublin story. It did start for me as a Dublin story, because the first interviews that we did were where the picket line had been. So everywhere we went, that 406 days, because the women themselves had begun to count out those days. And when we went to Tralee, there was a particular sign that really sort of grabbed my attention, and I could just kind of thought that's the sort of way of sort of structuring it, because because the stages that happened were being marked out on a daily basis during the strike by the women themselves. So it felt authentic to what the story was about. And we actually used the graphics that they had come up with down, that these sort of handmade sort of signs, and we took a lead for that. And I kind of enhanced that a little bit. And I think the colors that were used were very much, for me, like the Sex Pistols kind of album, back in the 1970s. Never mind the bollocks, here comes the Sex Pistols, I think was the title of the album. And so those things just sort of seemed to marry in a way. And but it was obviously a very useful device, because you could break up and people could feel, oh yeah, we're progressing towards the 406 days, so that was the kind of where that idea kind of came from, and we just developed it as we went through.
So, and Fergal had mentioned in the last podcast how you guys sourced a lot of, because there's so much coverage in this of the various incidents, so much, how you guys had sourced so much coverage from social media. And in a way, it's a testament to how, had this not have happened at this time, you might not have had that level. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was very interesting, because, as I said to you, like, I didn't know that much about the dispute before I became involved in the film. So I was like the eyes and ears of the sort of public nearly, in terms of doing it. But what was fascinating was the amount of social media that had been about, being recorded. So in a way, both myself and Fergus were able to look at a whole range of things. We were very lucky that people were because we were making the film from that point of view of the women who had been on the dispute. We got fantastic access to their own material and other supporters that had supported them. And so, the problem really was trying to sift through it and trying to find, what were the right pieces. And there was some issues of quality, but that was kind of interesting as well from my point of view, is once you establish something like that, it's the kind of content of what's happening in there that matters more than, it being, a pixel size, for a feature film, So that was kind of very interesting, and it was a real process that we went through, and both myself and Fergus worked really well together, that he gathered stuff up and then I sifted through it and like started using it as part of the edit. And then we'd go back and refine it and try and sort of get the best stuff that was out there for whatever we were doing. But I mean, I was concerned because like the arc of the story is that the defiance and the idea of going on strike and putting a picket right across the country, and that was really interesting. It was a national dispute, so that was kind of that was interesting.
And it is so funny as well. And one of the points that is made very well in the film is that if this was men, that wouldn't have happened in the same way. And what that footage captured with some of the dealings with the women when they came up against elements of security or even the Gardaí was sort of a lack of respect. And I even think like the boundaries weren't respected in the same way. And there's one bit, and it actually sort of haunts me. Like, it's a while back now. I think I saw the film twice in screenings, and it's a while back now, and I still think about it. And it's one of those run-ins and the lack of dignity that these women that are just fighting for their rights are being treated with at the hands of how the state are dealing with it. And this isn't Debenhams. This is how those legal aspects were enforced, and that sort of how neoliberal interests are protected at the end of the day on our dime, which is, and I think the film makes that point very subtly, and but it is there when you're watching it about how the structures in play are really unfair, and again I think you guys explain it with a very deft hand, because it doesn't kind of overwhelm the narrative. It's very much so you're in the moment, you're going through it. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to sort of editing something like this, I presume there's so much that ends on the cutting room floor, or so many perspectives that you're trying to get in. Is there like another version of this, or like if you
could have done an investigative journalist sort of piece. That wouldn't have been something that I'd done, because my strength was kind of telling those kind of stories from the ground. That's kind of the work that I'd been doing, and I think that's why myself and Fergus, that he was looking for somebody like that to work with on the project. So there, of course, there could be other versions of this film, I think, again, but again I just kind of came back to that idea of, we were following these women, the story that these women wanted to tell about this experience that they'd had. I think the thing was as well that because it was over a year, it had been quite traumatic for a lot of people. People were still, in a sense, shocked or sad about it. So the opportunity to tell that story, had a lot of energy and a lot sort of going for it. And that I sort of kind of recognized that fairly early on. So people were still very much embodied by the experience that they had gone through. As you say, towards the end of the film, you sort of see that these legal injunctions are being enforced. They're being enforced by the guards and stuff like that. And it was kind of, there's a sadness about that more than anything else. That that's what it came to. It's not that the guards were particularly sort of violent or, that wasn't the point of that. It was more just that this is where it was going,
Yeah, there was one moment that was very heavy-handed and that I felt was very shocking because, like, these are,
Yes.
it was one woman, the way she was being handled, we knew as
Yeah.
viewers, I presume the guard in question probably didn't, but that she had health issues. And it was just, I think it was the lack of dignity that they were affording her, the lack of respect. And like, and again, what was a very peaceful protest. I think it's just, and that is, and obviously you knew it because like it's one of the opening
Yeah.
moments of in the
I
film that
mean,
you're like, you're kind of haunted by it.
that's right. Yeah. And in a way, how was it that a daughter was sort of saying, don't harm my mother, that there's this danger. And for all of us, that idea of our mother being sort of manhandled in some way, is that there's something that's kind of frightening. And it was kind of to answer that question, how did it come to that in a way? That was the sort of starting point for me in making the film. How did this happen? What's the story behind this? And so that one moment at the beginning is obviously deliberately put at the beginning to try and unwind or unpack what that was all about. And that was what was really sort of on my mind, with that.
And as well, I think one of the really beautiful moments as well, and this is when you were talking about going into those interviews, is having those women talk about their experience, but from the, like, actually in the shop, which I presume, that kind of hollowed out husk of
Yeah.
a retail place
Yeah,
that they'd
it's
worked
like
for
a
so
sort of
many years.
but it's like sort of mausoleum to sort of the retail trade nearly, and that was really kind of key for us in terms of making it. We realized fairly quickly that because of COVID and because of the sort of downturn in the economies and stuff like that, these stores weren't going to open really quickly, but they would be released to somebody else fairly soon. And we realized that, Debenhams were no longer involved in the leases because they didn't really own very much property anymore at all. They just leased, and they leased it from Roach's stores. So as long as we just had insurance, we could go in. We just had to make a deal with the security company that it was okay for us to go in. So we had access to to the stores to film in, which was great because, as you say, there were these sort of hollowed out spaces, and that just sort of seemed to resonate with that idea of, what did these lives sort of that used to be sustained by a place like this, how do you reflect on that, and juxtaposing that with these empty sort of cavernous spaces was just interesting. And so we were obviously sort of flying drones and stuff inside, which was kind of interesting because drones are sort of used now like all the time with every single thing, but they're generally used for this kind of faraway stuff and to locate the context of the space and stuff like that, which is all very well. So it was kind of interesting just sort of using them close up and just using little small moves and stuff like that, like really sort of tracking shots, but because the spaces were empty, it wasn't that difficult to do that.
And talk to me as well about your creative partnership with Fergal. How do you guys, I presume, like, I mean, he's literally written the book on it, so I presume he's not going to be like the most, or Fergus, sorry, he's literally written the book on this, so he's not going to be the most hands-off, I presume, in terms of like creative dip, or is he like, I'll trust your vision 100%, or is he like, here, I actually know a little bit more about this?
Yeah, no, he very much trusted my thing, but we kind of worked together, like it was a sort of conversation really that we were having, over, and Fergus kind of did come in on the edit, so I'd sort of prepare chunks of it and we'd sit down, we'd discuss it, and I'd sort of say, look, I don't think that's working, or that needs to be, and vice versa. He would sort of say, we really need to be able to explain what this means, as you see, as time went on, as that winter sort of went on, it became harder and harder for them to man all the picket lines, you know, because it's just unrelenting. And but during that time, also a number of sort of strategic things kind of happened. There was negotiations that kind of stopped and started. There was promises made from KPMG that they wouldn't take stock out of the thing. If so, the women then were able to sort of say, oh, we only have to go in 3 nights a week or something like that, and the word was broken. So there was lots of things like that happened. You know, it was kind of a fuzzy sort of time. So Fergus was great at sort of saying, look, we actually have to kind of cover this one and this one and this one, but these other ones aren't that significant, you know. So, and it was all about trying to move the story forward, you know. So
God, and I'd say again, there's so much in there to kind of get a build up, but it's so exciting. Like when you're watching it, you're like, there's ups, there's downs, there's break-ins,
yeah,
there's like, it was a
it's funny, you know,
backstabbing, yeah,
yeah,
and at the core of it is a real kind of warm heart of these women and
yeah,
their like their spirit, their positivity the whole way through. Like, I mean, it's some feat to man, to really stand
yeah,
up for that amount of time, which is like a lot.
yeah.
406 is a lot of days.
And I think one of the women says at one stage, you know, is that, you know, they'd plan, say, an occupation, that they had to do the occupation because if they didn't do the occupation, they, you know, it all was going to be lost. You know, and then something else would come up in the news. You know, I think what she said was, oh, something else about COVID came up, you know, and just kind of knocked all of that work that they had done to try and bring themselves into the public attention. You know, something else happened in the Dáil or something else happened in the world, and it, you know, it was gone. So that was for that, they were very difficult times for them, you know. So I think the only thing that kind of did keep them going was their own the sort of friendships, I suppose, you build up and think at times like that and during disputes like this, you know, would have been quite intense, and I, you know, it would have been the thing that would have sustained people. But for a lot of other people, they just kind of drifted away, you know, slowly.
And again, I think since this has been out in the world, there has been some changes, thankfully. So I think you had a screening in the Dáil that was attended by all the slightly more left politicians, which was lovely to see.
Yeah, I
And a
mean, look, it
really
was a
powerful
good
discussion.
idea, you know. Yeah, it was a kind of fun night, but you know, like they were taking votes in the Dáil, so the people were up and down and in and out. It wasn't, you know, perfect screening by any manner or means, but it was, you know, I think it was important that for the women that the story, like they're not naive, you know, they don't think that, you know, this is going to change really anything enormous. But I think the important thing for them is that the story has been told and the story is kind of down in one place, and it's not the type of story that, you know, we make films that much about in Ireland. You know, there's no shots of Cliffs of Moher or the Wild Atlantic Way in this one. You know, so I think the achievement of making the story and us all sort of staying together and staying on the same page about it, which was very important to me, that, you know, this is not my story. This is a story that I've been asked to try and help to tell. But you know, you're making it with the people that it's about, and that's the way I kind of like to work. So you know, so that was important, and that was important that we were able to hold that together, you know, throughout the process. So towards the end of the edit, we did bring in a group of the really kind of shop stewards group from around the country and showed them and kind of talked about things, and people were generally really happy with what we'd done because they'd known the approach that we were taking as we were making the film, you know.
And definitely film as activism, film with changing minds and educating people. I think this ticks every single one of those boxes. It kept the story alive at a time where it would have been, again, I, as a viewer, when I first saw the film, had that vague memory, and then, that was blasted through with COVID. But then you're brought on that journey, and you're kind of, that represents all of those injustices that are happening at the moment in the world, and the intensity of them, and how unfair they are from that lived human experience. That we all know is like, what is fair, what is equal, is people sacrificing. But
yeah, like, I mean, it seems to me that, like, people can apply the law through injunctions and stuff like that, but then when it comes to sacking people with emails, there doesn't seem to be that many laws there to help people. They have to go to the court, to the WRC, to try and get sort of justice, and that justice is often strung out over years. Like, this case is in the WRC, and it was meant to be resolved a year and a half ago, and it's still kind of going through courts, through the Workplace Relations Committee. So, the processes are very cumbersome and difficult in terms of representation of people, whereas something like, the injunctions happen and they're applied and they just go through, So there is a contrast there, and I think that kind of casualization really of labor has, there's real dangers there. I mean, we're lucky at the moment. You sort of say, well, how was this kind of resolved from the women's point of view? I think because there's pretty much full employment in the economy, people were able to get other jobs, but they wouldn't have got jobs that would have had the sort of security that those jobs that they got 15, 20 years ago. They'd have nothing like that. They'd just be sort of casual contracts, I think. So, there's some of the very big sort of changes that have taken place. So we might kind of consider ourselves kind of lucky that we have a pretty buoyant economy at the moment. But, if that ever changed, that's, the consequences in terms of employment are quite dire, really, in terms of people's rights. I think the legislation that relates to the injunctions and that came in the early 1990s, I think in 1991, 1992, and and that's the legislation. That legislation probably needs to be looked at in the light of the changing nature of employment contracts.
And if this film highlights nothing else, it's that if you are a policymaker or lawmaker, the cost to the state has been very high. When there was money there was money to be found in the liquidation process. Like, there was stuff covered, but actually in enforcing the rights of this company to dissolve their assets and paying off all those social bills, like, it's just, yeah, you can kind of see how, it doesn't suit us as taxpayers to be, rallying behind these laws either. They really only help a very, very small few. But look, I was reading in May of this year, the workers did win. I mean, if you think of how much time has passed, this is 2023, but they did win a key battle in challenging their collective redundancies after a test case ended.
But KPMG appealed to that, and that appeal is still kind of going through. So they didn't get anything. So that's what I mean, in a way, that you kind of have, these huge accounting firms and law firms and stuff like that are international and internationally based and look at things internationally, and this was just a small cog in in liquidating the whole Debenhams kind of enterprise. And it was an important cog in that process, but, those companies can just keep things in the courts for a very long period of time. Now, there is meant to be a ruling on that judgment that you said. So that judgment did come out in favor, and it was good that it did. But within 2 or 3 weeks, the KPMG sort of appealed to that, and that's back in the process of things. So you're kind of talking about years out of people's lives, and I think sometimes that's how these people can win.
God, that's
because
so depressing.
it is pretty depressing, you know. But it's that's what kind of happens a lot of the time, you know. Things go legal and they go into processes that move very, very slowly. And, you know, the rest of us have to try and live our lives. You have to try and sort of make money to keep things going. And, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years is a long, long time, you know.
And has there been positives? Has there been, like good changes, or at least did this provide a catharsis and a sense of unity for the women and
I think
everyone
it did.
involved?
I think it's the achievement of the film is really putting the story down, and hopefully that story is there. Then I think it was hugely important to the women that all those different strands, and the fact that it had been a national dispute and that they had stayed together as a kind of as shop stewards groups, and that they had done, and really, the film is sort of saying that they were hard done by, and the film is sort of saying that this was wrong, what happened to them. And, I'm very happy that it's saying those things, and that's there hopefully forever, so you kind of can't take that away. But in terms of changing the world and changing legislation and those things, that's there's such different processes. And it was, like, I'm not a member of any political party or anything like that, but, it was those left-wing parties that did support, the women. And I think there was an element there, these people are just being used by these kind of left-wing kind of parties and stuff like that. And, that was, again, sort of insulting to the sort of women, that they'd allow themselves just to be used to further the ends of, political parties. I mean, it was the same sort of arrogance that was sort of saying that they didn't know how to negotiate, that 5 men could negotiate something that 11 women with hundreds of years experience, being able to, those sort of people wouldn't been able to understand it, That's what that was and that was all the time, like, that was the impression I got. And I kind of even got that about the film in a way. So I did try and I asked some questions of some of the politicians to sort of say, basically, were you running the show? Were they running the show? And it was very much, they were saying, look, no, the women were moving this thing forward, and we were there to sort of support them, But it was true that it was the more fringe left-wing parties that took an interest in it. Nobody else really took a huge interest in it.
And one might say the left isn't a fringe anymore. We've all been forced there.
Oh yeah,
because of the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With the way things are in the world, I mean, we're fairly lucky that we have a choice, that we can vote, and hopefully we can change things for the better, But I suppose it is, without kind of some sort of political change, a lot of the issues that are kind of embedded in this film won't be addressed,
Yeah. And it's great. It's great that it's still having a life. It's great that it's still being seen, and it's it's lovely to get to see it on the big screen. I think things like this also, they're more powerful to watch it in numbers, because it is a collective experience as well. As a society, we should all be invested in it. So you're screening at Still Voices Festival in November. Thank you so much.
Great, Gemma. Thank you.